Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field.
Hey, have you ever been faced with the challenge of sourcing, installing, and programming a used control module in a vehicle? I know a lot of us have. It seems to be happening more and more often today with the volume of control modules on vehicles, the cost of some new ones, or even the availability of new control modules. In some cases, used may be the only option. So what do you do here? I strongly recommend checking out SJ Auto Solutions and Tommy Oliva. Tommy offers a cloning service for used control modules to make these things plug and play for the vehicle that you're working on. In a lot of cases, he is also able to source the control modules if you're unable to locate one for the vehicle that you're working on. But once you get connected with Tommy, he's going to offer fantastic support from start to finish to make sure that that control module is going to work in your application. He's also got tech support that he offers through his website, along with some free resources there as well on information about used control module programming. So make sure to check out SJ Auto Solutions. I can't recommend that enough. This podcast is brought to you by Jarhead Diagnostics. Jarhead Diagnostics manufactures in-house diagnostic equipment and storage solutions, as well as distributes for companies like Pico, ATS, and TopDon. One of my favorite tools that I've bought from Brandon and Jarhead Diag is the case for the U-scope. If you don't have a U-scope, you probably should, but if you have one, you got to get one of these 3D printed cases, has a magnet on it, has a full-size BNC lead that you can connect to, and it gets rid of the weak point of that scope, which is the mini BNC connection, which is pretty fragile. This case makes this thing nice and secure and makes it an even better tool than it was. So check out jarheaddiag.com. The link is in the show notes. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping. I'll be your host once again for this week's episode. Thank you so much for joining me. It is just me this week. I'm going to discuss a topic that I run into quite often and have as long as I've been doing this, but ran into one recently, which the actual problem was pretty interesting diagnostic wise. And so that alone was worth talking about, I think. But I also thought it would be good to bring up the ever since you. If you've been in this industry and you've been fixing cars for any period of time for compensation, right? We're fixing cars for other people in one way or another. You've gotten the ever since you fixed blank, now blank is happening. Okay, it happens. It's going to happen if you're going to do work on vehicles. And that can take a lot of different forms, right? Sometimes this thing is real. It wasn't doing it until you touched the vehicle, and then other times not. And unfortunately, a lot of the times, as technicians, whatever we're doing to the vehicle, and we did take compensation for that, right? We provided a service, somebody paid us. Well, now we do have to figure out or determine one way or another, did we actually cause what's going on? Right. And I get sometimes it's ridiculous what's brought back to us to say, hey, ever since you changed my oil, my rear brakes are squeaking. Or we get a lot of it with programming, right? I got a ton of it when I was doing mechanical repairs at Firestone, all kinds of that. But I get it now when we're programming vehicles as well, right? We're updating something, we're programming a module after it's been replaced, and then we get the call later like, hey, this thing is happening now that it wasn't happening before. And again, this can take a whole lot of different forms, but I wanted to talk a little bit about how we handle it up front, and then what we actually do with the process to get through it. Because again, you're going to be faced with this. I think how you handle it is going to either be a detriment or a benefit to your business and your customer base, whoever that might be, right? I don't really deal with the general public too often, although I am working on their vehicles and the complaint may originate from them. I'm dealing with shops, but it's the same thing. Even if I was dealing with the general public, we want to be as professional as possible in these situations. And I think there's a good way to do that where we're not losing out in the situations where we didn't do anything, but we are going to cover the times where we did. Because let's face it, sometimes it is us. Sometimes that ridiculous thing that is happening, we actually caused it. And I think that's more possible on vehicles nowadays where these systems are so complex and integrated, interconnected in one way or another. You can do something on this part of the car and now this other thing is happening, and you wouldn't make that connection normally, but it can happen, right? And that's kind of the story today, to be totally honest. But I'm, again, going to go through the kind of the ever since you thing. Sometimes when a customer brings this to you, it's just coincidence, right? The vehicle legitimately wasn't doing that thing prior to the repair, but now it is after they've taken it back. You did not cause it, right? You did front brakes. Now the rear brakes are grinding. Well, maybe you didn't do your inspection, right? That's a totally different discussion. Let's leave that out of that for right now. But let's just say it is something totally unrelated to the work that you did, and you actually didn't cause that. It's just a really bad coincidence. That can happen. It's not super common, but I've had that happen. I'll never forget when I first started at a shop, one of the older mechanics was telling me about this sort of thing and how it can just be bad luck sometime, where he did all this front suspension work and brake work on a vehicle, and then it went down the road maybe a block and the timing belt snapped on it. And it was time for that timing belt to be done. It had just been worn out, high mileage. The technician didn't do that. He didn't break that timing belt. It just was really bad coincidence. Now, from the customer's perspective, though, well, he must have done something to the vehicle, right? And he was telling me that story of just like, hey, do really good inspections and, recommend what needs to be recommended on the vehicle. So then at least it's documented that, hey, you recommended it's a timing belt because of X amount of miles, right? We can't perceive all of this. Sometimes that coincidence is just going to happen and we're going to have to deal with it, right? And again, how you handle that situation is going to reflect upon your business. Sometimes it's legit. Sometimes you actually did break that thing when you did the work. And of course, in that situation, you want to correct that for the customer. And hopefully you have the chance to do so. The worst is when it goes somewhere else and you hear about it later, or they send you a bill. I always wanted the chance to correct what was going on, or if I caused it, or at least have the chance to. So occasionally this is malicious on the side of the customer. And I've been in that situation. I'd say this is not that common. Usually it's just a misunderstanding, right? The customer doesn't understand the complexity of the vehicle. They just don't understand the vehicle as far as the interconnections of systems, right? As people who service the cars, the repair work or the programming that we do, like we have a good understanding of how systems operate on a vehicle, where they are, what they do, what other systems they interact with. And we could say pretty easily like, hey, okay, I programmed the PCM, this wheel speed sensor code shouldn't really have anything to do with it. Okay, and there's, I'm sure, an example where that's not the case, and that's kind of the point of this conversation. But again, we can point out and say, hey, these two things are very unrelated, where a customer's not going to be able to do that. They don't have the understanding of the complexity of the vehicle. So they're just presented with, hey, my car was here, it got worked on, whatever it was fixed. They don't quite understand exactly what's going on, and now it's broken. Well, what's the common denominator there? It was in the shop, The technician did the work. I need to bring it back to him. Hey, ever since you did this, now this is happening. And it's on us to prove that. Now, back to what I was mentioning, sometimes this is malicious. They know that whatever is happening was not caused by the work that was done, and they had the intention up front of getting something fixed for free. And again, not very common. I would say this is rare, but it happens, and there are people like that out there. There's a lady at Firestone that she did this intentionally. And she knew how this game works, especially at Firestone. If you go up the chain and you complain, higher up the chain, you will get stuff for free. And so she'd bring her car in for an oil change. And then, boy, oh boy, you were married to that car. You owned it. Anything that was wrong with that car for the next 6 months, she was back there and she would get it fixed for free. It was terrible. And so nobody wanted to work on her car. And I think eventually they told her, we're not going to service your vehicle anymore, because it was every time she came in. All of a sudden, we're fixing 5 or 6 other things that had nothing to do with her tire rotate or her oil change or her alignment check. Again, it's rare, but it happens. And a lot of times, we're put on the defensive when a customer comes back with something like this. And our immediate thought is like, well, I didn't do that, especially if you didn't do it intentionally. Which is, again, most of the time. Most of the time, these things, even if we did cause it, it wasn't intentional. So we're like, no, I didn't do that. And so you almost get defensive about it and start thinking, well, this guy or gal is just trying to get something for free out of me. But I don't think it's the case. Most of the time, it's just that they don't understand the complexity of the vehicle or the interconnection. Sometimes it can be like a buyer's remorse, I think, especially when somebody spends a lot of money on a vehicle for a repair. Now they are attuned to any little thing that's going on with the vehicle because they spent that money and they want a new vehicle, right? Especially if it's like an engine or a trans, a big ticket item. They just drop like $6-7 on this thing. Yeah, any little thing that's happening with that car that they perceive to be an issue, they're going to bring back to you, even if it was there before and they didn't notice it because they didn't care at that point. That happens too, right? And so we've got to sort through all of this stuff. And I'm talking a lot more on the repair side of things, but I lived in that world for quite a while as a technician, and I see it still in shops. But like I mentioned, with the programming, we get that a fair amount as well. And it kind of goes back to the same thing, is sometimes the customers don't quite understand. I would say a lot of the time, customers don't exactly understand what we're doing when we're programming and what actually happens, what doesn't happen, the tools that we're using, what could potentially happen from this program or what couldn't. Like, what problem could you have from programming a solenoid strategy? I had this not that long ago. Program a solenoid strategy on a Ford truck, calls us up, said, hey, this thing doesn't go into gear anymore. I'm like, that has nothing to do with what we did. The solenoid strategy, I explained it to him. It's just flow rates for the solenoids, this and that. But there was really no understanding of what we did, right? And so we document, right? Because the program is kind of mysterious. It's just a bunch of zeros and ones. And to be totally honest, like, I can say I understand what I'm doing, and I kind of do, but how far do I really understand? Do I really understand all the zeros and ones that are going into that module and be able to tell you exactly what's being changed and where? No, not always. What I'm doing is I'm using factory software, factory tooling, and following the service information that the factory provides for whatever, condition that I'm in to repair that vehicle. And so I'm going to follow those, and that's the best that I'm going to offer you. I'm going to document it with screenshots and show you, here's what we did. We programmed the solenoid strategy. This is what it does. It's the flow rate for the solenoids. Has nothing to do with the position, the gear. It has nothing to do with what gear the transmission goes into or not. You should be able to unplug the transmission and still be able to get it into gear in this particular application. But anyways, we get that a lot with programming because there's kind of a mystery behind what's actually happening when we do that. We hook up with a laptop, we hit some buttons, things happen, right? And so there's been a number of times where we'll get that, hey, ever since you this, this happened. And again, sometimes it is on us. I had a Ford Explorer that we did a BCM on, and it was actually a clone job. It was a used BCM, and the door locks would just randomly cycle. And they said that was not the case prior to doing that. Well, it ended up, it was whatever happened when we cloned that BCM, that weird random intermittent problem got put in there. I wouldn't even say cloned over because it wasn't a problem before, but we caused it. And so we had to do some different type of programming to get that one to work, but then it was gone. Like, we definitely caused that problem when we did it. And we didn't realize right away because it was kind of intermittent when the door locks would cycle. But what it comes down to is we are responsible for proving whatever problem exists is on us or not. The trouble that I've found with this is that it wastes a lot of time, right? Obviously, we're running a business. We want to be spending the time that we drive to a shop and time at the shop for making money so that everybody can get paid and the business can run, right? That's obvious. And so when we're going back and we're spending, the drive time plus, hour at the vehicle to figure out, okay, hey, this is not something that we caused. Here's the proof. That can eat up a lot of time. That can kill a day if you're doing that 2-3 times a day. So what do we do with these situations? I want to give credit to somebody, a friend of mine, Corey Brueggemann out in Staten Island. He does mobile work out there. And a while back, this discussion was being had between a number of different mobile guys. And we were talking about this situation. Like, what do? You get all these callbacks. How do you handle it? And this is his line, and we use it, so 100% stole it from him, but I want to give him credit. When someone calls with the, hey, ever since you blank, now blank is happening, what you say is, oh, okay, well, we're happy to come out and take a look at that and figure out if it's anything that we did. If we caused it in any way, we'll take care of it. No problem. No charge to you. But if it's not something that we caused, we have to charge for our time, our diagnostic time to figure that out. We'll give you proof. We'll figure out what's wrong either way, and we'll prove it to you. And we'll be honest, of course. I am happy to have Automotive Seminars as a sponsor for the show. Now, if you're not familiar, Automotive Seminars is a diagnostic technician training company. They've got a website that there'll be a link to in the show notes. And what they offer is top-notch training to technicians like us in the field. I've been taking their training courses for years and have got a ton of benefit out of it. They've got top-notch instructors, John Thornton, Scott Shotton, Scott Manna, and every other month they've got a 2-night course that you can sign up for. Join in, ask questions, and afterwards, you've paid for the course, you can access a recorded version whenever you want. You can rewatch the class 2 years later in case you wanted some details on it, and that is a fantastic feature. So make sure to check out the website to see what courses they have available and what's coming up in the future. But we have to get paid if it's not something that we caused. Now, that puts us in a good position. Number one, we're not being defensive about it. We've told them, hey, we're going to help you out. We're going to figure out your problem. And if it's on us, you're not paying us any more money to come out there and figure that out. But in the situation where it is not, well, we're getting a diag fee out of that. And this has worked really well for us. It's been better for customer relations because, again, we're not getting defensive about it, right? Because you feel like you're being attacked. Someone's criticizing your work, and it's easy to get into that defensive state, and that's not going to turn out well. This way, we're like, hey, maybe it is something that we did, but we're going to have to come out there and check it out. Hopefully they give us a chance to do that, and then we can then it is on us to prove it, and that takes a lot of different forms. But luckily, that's part of what we do, and why I just doing programming without diag, like that capability to do the diagnostic, I think would be really, really tough. Because what do you do in a situation where you can't diagnose something, you programmed it, and then somebody's like, well, hey, it's doing this thing, and you don't have the ability to figure out exactly what it is or what it isn't? that would be tough. But luckily we do. That's part of the services we offer. So then we can come in and do that. And then, hey, maybe we get a diagnostic out of it and we're making money, or we find out it's something we did and we eat it and we learn a lesson and we try to do better in the future. And so that brings us to the vehicle that I had this week, and a situation where we don't want to overlook the complexity of these vehicles and the interconnection of the systems. And this one could have been avoided. Easy enough to do, and sort of why I'm talking about it. But anyways, here's the situation. It's another solenoid strategy. This is a 2017 Ford F-250. This is a transmission shop we do a ton of work for, have a great relationship with them, and we were called in to do the solenoid strategy. And when we do that, we also check, depending on the setup of the vehicle, whether the transmission control module or powertrain control module has any software updates, and we do those at the same time. But mainly it's for the transmission solenoid strategy. For this one, we got there, checked for updates. There were none. So they provide us with the solenoid strategy, which is just the flow rates of the solenoids that control fluid flow in the valve body and the transmission that was installed, right? So that's new. The PCM is external, and it's going to have that solenoid strategy and body ID number stored in there. We're going to use Ford IDS, and we're going to put those new numbers in there so that it knows the flow rates. And we do this a lot, right? It's really common. You replace the Ford transmission, you need that tag, and you put those numbers in there. Very standard. We do a ton of them. It's really a kind of a gravy job, because as long as you have the number, it's real simple to do. You can be in and out pretty quickly, and we do a ton of them. And so anyways, we do that and there's no issues. Okay, we get our screenshots, document everything, pre-post scan. And that's another important one. Do a pre-post scan, because you can say pretty quick, like, yeah, hey, that code was there before. But anyways, we have all that stuff and we move on with our day. And a few days later, the guy who runs the shop calls up my administrator, Mike, and says, hey, that solenoid strategy you guys did the other day, the customer took the vehicle and he says there's a problem that wasn't there before. He's like, the interior lights and the headlights are randomly flashing. They would just drop out and come back on when the vehicle's running. And it's pretty consistent. You wait 5 minutes and it's happening. We scanned it. There's no codes in there, but this guy swears up and down that this was not doing this before the work that was performed. He asked us, he's like, have you ever heard of that happening from a programming? And we're like, no, that doesn't sound like anything that, could be correlated to a solenoid strategy. And he knows pretty well, like, what we're doing when we're programming that. But he's like, okay, well, we went over the stuff we did when we installed the transmission, and that's kind of where we were thinking the problem was going to be, is like, okay, maybe like a loose ground or something when you did the transmission. He's like, we didn't find anything, but we wanted to check and just see in case there was something, maybe that you guys were aware of that could happen or whatever. There was nothing accusatory in the first call. He just was kind of reaching out to see, because he didn't have too many answers. So, and we just told him, like, I don't think that would have anything to do with it. It just doesn't make any sense. There shouldn't be any correlation between a solenoid strategy and a PCM and lights randomly flashing in the vehicle. Okay. So it's another day or two. The shop really digs into this and tries to figure out what's going on, and they were unable to. They didn't really get anywhere. They really went over everything they did. Right. Because in this case, they believe their customer. They don't have any feelings that this is something malicious. The guy's honest. He's like, hey, it wasn't doing this before. And they reach a dead end with it. And they're like, hey, they call us back and they're like, hey, can you just come out and figure out what's going on with this? Like, we'll pay you to do it. It wasn't even like, hey, we want a freebie. They just want to know what's going on with this vehicle. And fair enough. So we come out there and we check this thing out. And so I'm digging into this, and I was able to duplicate it pretty well. Interestingly enough, you had to start the vehicle and have it running, and not only would the dome lights flash, the headlights would flash, and they would like turn off and turn back on, and you could hear the relay click in the BCM, which is over in the right kick panel when this would happen. And it'd be just real brief, just click on off, and if you had the key in the on position, they wouldn't do it. I thought that was interesting. The other thing I noticed, because I'm just trying to like observe like, well, how much stuff is turning on and off when this happens? Is it because I noticed the dome lights that were doing it, and I noticed the headlights that were doing it. Nothing else really seemed visible, but there was a reset of the warnings that would pop up on the instrument cluster, right? So I'm sitting in this vehicle, I have the door open, and at first the Ford will give you like an indicator that the door is ajar. And then if you hit OK on the steering wheel, you get rid of the messages. And there was a couple other messages as well. I forget what the other two were, or I think the hood was open or something like that. But if you hit OK, those messages will go away until you cycle the key again. Well, every time this would happen, these lights would flash, those warnings would bing at me, and they'd pop back up on the dash again. I thought that was interesting. And what I'm doing here, like before, as I'm doing my scan of the vehicle, I'm just like observing to see what's going on with this thing. Is there any clues that I can get in order to diagnose or get me in the right direction? And that, I thought that was interesting. Like it's a reset of something that's happening. And I was also thinking like dome lights and headlights. I haven't even looked at a diagram yet, but those shouldn't be on the same circuit, right? Those should be separate circuits. Maybe they're controlled by the same module, but this is like a reset of a module happening. It's my initial feelings as far as what's going on. So I do my scan of the vehicle, and I don't have any codes, or at least I don't have any codes pertaining to what was going on with it. Okay, fair enough. Let's at least figure out who controls the headlights or who controls the dome lights, right? I know those are things that are being turned on and off, and so I'm going to go that direction and figure out who controls them and investigate that component further. And turns out it's the body control module on this truck. Okay, so... And we do a lot of BCMs on Ford pickup trucks. It's not an uncommon thing to have problems with these. And maybe that's all this is. And hey, again, just bad luck, coincidence, right? Okay, well, let's prove it. Let's have some documented proof, and then we can get paid and move on with our day. So I go into the BCM. Again, no codes. Run a self-test on it. Doesn't pop up with anything that's helpful there. I do go into the data PIDs, and I want to watch some data PIDs as this is happening and just try to like get a sense of, am I losing an input of some sort? Am I losing a power feed? Is this a network issue? Let's see what we can find. And I started with some lighting PIDs because the lights are the things that I can observe that are, you know, blinking and happening. So I'm looking at the lighting PIDs, and when it happens, you can see the data drop out. And what I mean by drop out is, for instance, there was like an ambient light mode, and it would have, I think dark was the option that you saw because we were in the shop, and I think it would move to like daylight or something like that was the other option as far as the data PID went. But when this would happen, it would briefly go to NA, which is like a third option for the data PID. And I pulled up some other lighting data PIDs, and I pulled up some ignition switch data PIDs because I'm like, well, this is interesting. The headlight switch, I'm looking at all this stuff. They all go to NA, regardless of what the input is. There were some that didn't change, but the ones that did change along with this glitch just went to NA, which I thought was weird. It's not like it's an input changing status. It's like the whole thing's resetting or something like that. And I'm really thinking network at this point, honestly, is my first thing that I want to eliminate. I was like, I'm going to scope the network here. So I'm wondering if there's something happening on the network that's just glitching out this BCM. Because I just thought the NA thing was weird because you're actively communicating with the BCM at that point through the scan tool. And if there's a dropout in the network of some sort, maybe that's what's causing this to happen. That's kind of where I was thinking. And I was like, I'm going to scope the network. Well, where do I scope the network on this Ford? The DLC on this Ford is actually a little gateway module, and depending on the configuration, you might have to go to the back of this thing if you want to get onto the actual network. But this is where I got a pretty good clue as to the direction I'm headed. I went under the dash to kind of look at this gateway module, and I see immediately that there's something aftermarket connected to this Ford. Now, how this is set up, it's actually pretty clean. I didn't notice it at first. And when Steve was doing the solenoid strategy, he didn't notice this either. The OBD2 port wasn't the actual OBD2 port. It was a jumper harness. Now, it was done, again, very cleanly. Like, you couldn't tell, and you really had to look at it closely to see that all the pins were occupied. That's the giveaway. If you see an OBD2 port with 16 pins, they all have female terminals in them, really, you got to look at that thing and see if it's jumper harness. It probably is. I don't think I've ever seen from the manufacturer vehicle that has all the pins occupied. I'm sure it's out there, but it's not common. And that usually means there's some sort of jumper harness that is tied to some type of aftermarket device, whether it's a remote start, a GPS tracker, security device, whatever it might be. Well, this truck had one. And the way it worked is it plugged into the OBD2 port, and it had a cable that went up under the dash to another component, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then it came back to the OBD2 port, and it subbed in an like another OBD2 port over this one. And again, it was really clean. Like, you couldn't tell just by looking down that that's not the vehicle's factory OBD2 port, but if you looked at it closely, you could tell. So what that means is when I plug in my scan tool, I'm actually going through another device before I get to the actual OBD2 port. It's not exactly in series, but you're definitely making contact through the network to this aftermarket device if you're communicating with the vehicle, okay? And so what this was, if you want to think about it this way, it would go scan tool to jumper harness to aftermarket device to real OBD2 port. So anything you plug in, it's going to go that path. Now, what is this aftermarket device? Well, it had a name on it, said Z Flash, and it looked like a little OBD2 dongle, the same size as like a Chrysler Micropod. Really, it had a little mini USB port on it, and it had another couple wires that were wired up somewhere under the dash. And I didn't know what this thing was for. I Googled it to see. This is a custom light flasher unit, and it's meant to tie into the bus, just like it is on this vehicle, and allow you to run custom light flashing on the vehicle, utilizing the vehicle's factory circuits, right? So what I mean by that is you can get the headlights and the parking lights all to flash like an emergency vehicle, or there's several different custom patterns, by tying this in to the CAN bus the way that it is. And this is actually a work truck that we're working on. It had DOT stickers on the side of it. And it makes sense why, if they're pulled over the side of the road, they might want those lights to flash like an emergency vehicle. And this is where I was looking in the truck, and I see there's a row of switches up on the roof panel inside the vehicle, but you could hit these switches and then the lights would start flashing. And I tried it. I'm like, okay, that's what this thing actually is. Could this be my problem? Now, I mentioned the problem is with the lighting that's flashing. This thing's on the network. It's aftermarket, which I'm always thinking could be a problem. So I'm like, well, let's unplug it and see what happens. So that's easy enough to do. You just unplug it from the OBD2 port. So I do that, and I wait, and I wait, and I wait, and my problem's gone. And I cycle the key, and I do all this stuff. My lights are no longer flashing. My dropout that I was having with the data PIDs in the BCM is gone. That's it. Okay, well, I fixed it, right? This aftermarket device, that's it. And then I got to thinking, is it possible that we caused this? And I think it is possible because, in a way, we programmed through this device when we did the solenoid strategy, right? When Steve did the initial programming, he plugged into the jumper harness, and in order for our programming the voltage pulses, the zeros and ones, to reach the PCM, which they did. I mean, we did change the solenoid strategy to what it was supposed to be. It at least made, I guess I'm trying to search for a word here, contact with, or this aftermarket device was exposed to the programming. Now, this is where, like I mentioned earlier, how much do I know exactly what's going on when you program something, right? Now, there's got to be something that happens on the bus where the VCM 2 or 3 or whatever you're using tells the modules that, hey, you're being programmed with this information, right? We're putting this data in there. And, solenoid strategy isn't a complete software reprogramming, but we're putting data into a module when we're doing that. We're updating something. And is it possible when that happened that something also happened to this aftermarket device? It is possible. Now, I have no way to prove that it did happen when we programmed this vehicle. I also have no way to prove that it didn't happen. This is where, I've kind of reached a limitation. I found out what was causing the issue. This aftermarket device, when unplugged, gets rid of the problem, and when plugged back in, I powered it down a few times. Every single time it recreates the problem. And it makes sense, right? It's in control of operating emergency lights, and something's going on with the software in this little device, and it's causing the BCM to flash all the lights intermittently when it's not supposed to. I know the problem's in there, and I know it's probably a corrupt software. I mean, could it have happened potentially when they disconnected the battery on this thing and then reconnected it? Stuff happens like that with software. We see radios and other modules, just completely die sometimes just from a battery disconnect. Maybe the software is doing some sort of internal update like the footwell modules on the BMWs and the Minis, and you disconnect the battery at that point and it's a brick. Now, is it salvageable? You'd need the software that little unit was designed to use. I went on the website, the Z-Flash website, and it didn't look like you could get the software unless you bought the unit, which was a couple $100. Maybe whoever installed this, it kind of looked like it might have been a fleet truck, even though it's at a transmission shop. Maybe they have the software and they could try reflashing this thing. Is it worth the effort? Just buy a new one or disconnect it. They probably want it on there, and I'll let this guy talk to his customer and see what they want to do. But here's where I'm at. I'm going to take the customer, the owner of the vehicle, at his word that this was not happening prior to the vehicle being in the shop. Now, is it something the shop did, which I'm guessing really could have only been a battery disconnect? Or did it happen when we programmed through the jumper harness to this thing? Is that possible? It's definitely possible, and I can't prove that it's not. So as a business owner, and I want to maintain a good reputation and a good relationship with this shop, I'm just going to offer to pay for a new one of these things. It's a couple $100. It's not a big deal and not worth arguing over, or really even for me personally, it's not even worth trying to fix this thing for a couple $100. I'll just buy a new one. They can get it, plug it in, and then their lights are back to working properly. So that's what I offered the guy. I told him the scenario. He's very understanding. He gets it. He was more pissed off. He's like, he hates the aftermarket stuff on vehicles, like remote starts and all that, just as much as I do, because he's in this world. He sees them cause problems on vehicles all the time. And, just one more instance on it. So he was going to talk to his customer and let us know, but I offered to pay for a new one. Now, for us in the future, it's a good lesson. And I've warned my guys before and myself to look for a jumper harness. Check out that DLC. If all of the pins are occupied, all 16, okay, let's disconnect it and connect to the real OBD2 port before we program. And hey, this is a good lesson, good reminder for us to do that very closely. Put a flashlight on that DLC before you plug into it, because even if it looks like it's the actual OBD2 port, it might not be. And then you could potentially create problems like this. A lot of the time when you program through a jumper harness, it can just fail the programming itself. Like you could have issues getting the programming to the module in question. That wasn't the case here, but hey, it turns out you could potentially screw up an aftermarket device that's tied into that jumper harness as well, which I have a feeling that's what happened here. Again, can't prove it, can't say for sure, but it sure seems likely that that's what occurred on this particular vehicle. So anyways, I hope you found that interesting. And again, good reminder on a couple different things there, the Ever Sense You Club, and then, programming through a jumper harness, things to think about when we're out there doing this. But let me know your best Ever Sense You story. Post it up in the Facebook group. Some of them can actually be quite humorous. But other than that, thank you for listening. Really appreciate it. So let's get out there, start fixing the world one car at a time.